The battlefield was silent now, the echoes of war having long since faded into the endless void above. Smoke curled from the twisted remains of fallen war machines, their once imposing frames now nothing more than shattered husks scattered across the desolate plains. The stench of charred metal and burnt flesh clung to the air, an acrid reminder of the battle that had raged here mere hours ago. Among the wreckage, a lone figure lay still, his body sprawled in the dirt as though discarded by fate itself. His armor, though once formidable, was now scorched and battered, the insignias upon his chest plate long eroded by the cruel passage of time and war. His breathing was shallow, ragged, each inhalation a struggle against the pain that threatened to drag him into unconsciousness. Blood, dark and viscous, oozed from a deep gash above his brow, trickling down his face in lazy rivulets before vanishing into the dust beneath him. Boots crunched against debris as a squad of Galactic Federation soldiers approached, their figures casting long shadows under the pale glow of the twin moons overhead. Their power armor gleamed, unmarred by the battle, a stark contrast to the destruction that surrounded them. They moved with an air of confidence, their weapons slung loosely across their backs, their visors reflecting the dying embers of a battlefield. One of them, a captain whose insignia marked him as a leader, stopped a few feet away from the fallen warrior. He tilted his head slightly, observing the motionless form before him. With a casual motion, he lifted his rifle and prodded the man's side with the barrel, as one might poke a corpse to confirm its demise. "Still breathing," the captain remarked, his voice crackling through his helmet's external speakers. He turned to his squad, a smirk playing at his lips. "Looks like we found ourselves a survivor." Another soldier stepped forward, his tone laced with amusement. "Survivor? More like a relic. Look at him, his ancient. Should have stayed in whatever grave he crawled out of." Laughter rippled through the group, their voices filled with cruel mirth. They were young, too young to recognize the weight of history, too arrogant to see the warning signs hidden in the stillness of their prey. One soldier, his curiosity piqued, crouched beside the fallen man and reached for his helmet. The mask was scratched and scorched, but there was something unsettling about it, something that made the soldier hesitate for the briefest of moments before prying it off. As the mask came away, revealing the man's face beneath, the soldier's laughter faltered. Deep scars marred his weathered skin, lines etched by time and war. His dark, hollow eyes remained closed, his expression eerily calm despite the blood that streaked his face. A thick, unkempt beard framed his jaw, its silver strands hinting at the years he had endured. "Just some old dog," one of them muttered, breaking the silence. "Looks like he's seen one too many wars." The captain chuckled, regaining his composure. "Well, whatever wars he fought, they didn't help him much, did they?" He nudged the man's shoulder with his boot, sneering. "You picked the wrong fight, old man." Another soldier scoffed. "I bet he was some washed-up mercenary who thought he could make a name for himself. Probably ran out of luck decades ago." The squad laughed again, though there was something less certain about their mirth now. The unease that had crept into their ranks was subtle, like the whisper of a coming storm. The captain ignored it. With a bored sigh, he tapped his wrist communicator, linking his signal back to command. "Command, this is Captain Orris of the 7th Battalion. We've found a survivor. Just some old relic from the battlefield. Nothing to worry about. Requesting transport for—" He never finished his sentence. A sound, so soft, so deceptively quiet, cut through the air. A crack, like the shifting of bones, the whisper of steel against flesh. The fallen man's fingers twitched. His breathing, though weak before, evened into something steady. "Controlled," one of the soldiers noticed first. His amusement faded into confusion, then dread. "Sir, I think his." Too late. Faster than their augmented vision could track, the old warrior's hand shot forward, his fingers closing around the soldier's wrist with a grip like iron. There was no hesitation, no moment of struggle, only a sickening snap as the soldier's arm twisted at an unnatural angle, bone splintering beneath the pressure. A strangled scream tore from his throat, but it was silenced just as quickly by a brutal, efficient movement, one so fast that the others barely registered it. The warrior had taken the soldier's own dagger. One moment, it was sheathed at the soldier's hip. The next, it was buried to the hilt in his throat. The laughter was gone now. Panic flared in the remaining soldiers as their comrade collapsed, blood gurgling from his lips, his body convulsing for a brief moment before stilling forever. "Shit! Open fire!" The order came too late. The warrior moved like a shadow given form, a ghost wrenched from the abyss. His movements were not those of a desperate man fighting for survival. They were calculated, refined, honed by an eternity of war. He was not flailing. He was executing. The second soldier barely had time to raise his rifle before the warrior was upon him. A single, brutal strike shattered his visor, the reinforced glass splintering into 1,000 fragments as the force of the blow sent him sprawling to the ground. The others fumbled for their weapons, their fingers trembling against the triggers. The captain staggered back, his breath coming in short gasps. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. One moment, they had been mocking a broken man. The next, he was slaughtering them like cattle. This wasn't possible. This wasn't natural. He had been certain the old warrior was just another nameless corpse to be, a relic of a forgotten past. But as the soldier's body fell, the last flickers of life fading from his unseeing eyes, something clicked into place in the captain's mind. The scars, the stillness, the precision. And then, the name whispered itself into his thoughts, unbidden and unwanted. A name that should have been long buried. A name that did not belong to the past. Baba Yaga. His blood turned to ice. The warrior, no, the legend, straightened from his latest kill, his dark eyes now open, locking onto the remaining soldiers. The twin moons cast a shadow long over the battlefield, a specter of death reborn. Baba Yaga lived, and the fools had laughed at him. Fear was a living thing now, a parasite that burrowed into the soldiers' minds, feeding on the growing realization of their folly. The battlefield, once a graveyard of the fallen, had transformed into something far worse, a hunting ground, and they were the prey. Baba Yaga stood among the bodies, his form still, his gaze unreadable. Blood dripped from the dagger clutched in his grip, the viscous fluid pooling at his feet, seeping into the dust. He did not rush toward his next target, nor did he make any move to attack. He merely watched. For the soldiers, that was somehow worse. Captain Oris took a trembling step backward, his heart hammering against his rib cage. He had heard the name before, spoken only in whispers by the old veterans, the ones who had survived wars that had shaped the stars. The name had drifted through barracks like a ghost story, a relic of a past generation's nightmares. Baba Yaga, a name that should have been buried with the last century, a name that could not belong to the man standing before them now. This is impossible, Oris muttered under his breath, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Baba Yaga is dead. He has been dead for decades. The warrior tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes fixed on the captain. A slow smirk played at his lips, an expression devoid of warmth, devoid of amusement. It was the smile of a predator who had already decided how the hunt would end. Oris swallowed hard, forcing steel into his spine. This man, this thing, might have been a nightmare of the past, but the Federation was the future. Their armor was state-of-the-art, their weapons advanced beyond anything warriors of old could have imagined. He was just one man. Oris activated his calm full back. He ordered, his voice steadier than he felt. Regroup and... Baba Yaga moved. He was upon them before they could react. A blur of motion, a whisper of wind, and then the first soldier's throat was open, a crimson arc painting the night air. His body crumpled before the others could even register the kill. Oris cursed, firing his rifle. Plasma rounds illuminated the battlefield in eerie flashes, but they met only empty space. Baba Yaga had already shifted, weaving between the chaos like a phantom. A second soldier, panicked and fumbling, tried to raise his gun, but the warrior closed the distance with terrifying speed. A single, devastating strike shattered the soldier's helmet, the force snapping his head back at an unnatural angle. His body hit the ground with a lifeless thud. The remaining soldiers abandoned all thoughts of strategy. Their training, the drills drilled into them since the academy, had shattered beneath the weight of terror. They fired wildly, their movements erratic, their fear overriding logic. But their target was gone. Baba Yaga had melted into the shadows. The night was silent once more, save for their ragged breathing. The acrid scent of burnt plasma lingered in the air, mixing with a sickly sweet smell of fresh blood. Oris turned frantically, his rifle sweeping the darkness. "Where is he?" He barked, but there was no answer. Then, from the shadows, a voice, a whisper that slithered into their bones like ice. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." A soldier screamed as a hand shot out of the darkness, dragging him into the abyss. A gurgled cry, the wet sound of a blade meeting flesh, and then silence. Panic exploded among the survivors. One broke rank entirely, turning on his heels to flee. He didn't make it far. A figure emerged from the shadows, and with a single, brutal movement, Baba Yaga drove his blade through the soldier's back, twisting the knife until the body went limp. The last two soldiers collapsed to their knees, their weapons forgotten, their courage shattered. "Mercy," one of them choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, have mercy." Baba Yaga stared at him, his expression unreadable. "Mercy," he repeated, as if testing the word on his tongue. He took a slow step forward. The soldier flinched, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps. Baba Yaga knelt, bringing his face close, his voice dropping to something barely more than a breath. "I remember mercy," he said, almost thoughtfully. "I remember the screams of those who begged for it, the same ones your Federation slaughtered." The soldier whimpered. "Mercy is for the innocent." And with that, he slit the man's throat. Captain Orris was the last one left. His entire squad, elites, trained killers, the pride of the Federation, lay dead at his feet. His rifle trembled in his grasp, his mind reeling, his body frozen with terror. Baba Yaga turned his gaze upon him, stepping forward with a measured pace. Orris stumbled back, his breath coming in panicked gasps. I didn't know," he stammered. "I didn't know who you were." Baba Yaga said nothing. "I didn't." Orris swallowed hard, his voice breaking. "I was just following orders." A long silence stretched between them. The night air was thick with the scent of death, the ground slick with the blood of the fallen. Then Baba Yaga smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "So was I," he murmured. Orris barely had time to scream. Not the searing, immediate agony of a fresh wound, but something deeper, something ancient, a pain woven into the very fabric of a man's soul, lingering long after the blood has dried. Captain Orris was drowning in it. He lay on his back, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his mind reeling from the sheer horror that had unfolded before him. The bodies of his squad, his men, his brothers in arms, lay scattered like broken dolls around him. The acrid scent of scorched plasma filled his nostrils, mingling with the coppery tang of fresh blood. This wasn't a battle. This was a massacre, and he was the only one left. His limbs trembled as he struggled to push himself upright, his fingers slipping against the blood-soaked ground. His rifle was gone, ripped from his grasp in the chaos. His sidearm was still holstered, but he knew it wouldn't make a difference. A shadow moved in the corner of his vision. His breath caught in his throat. Baba Yaga stood mere feet away, watching him in silence. The warrior's form was still, eerily calm amidst the carnage, his dark eyes unreadable. Blood dripped from his blade, pooling at his feet, but his posture was relaxed, casual, almost. That, more than anything, terrified Orris. There was no rage in Baba Yaga's gaze, no fury, no hatred. Just the cold, dispassionate stillness of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. Orris had faced death before. He had stood on the front lines of war, had watched comrades fall, had seen the light fade from the eyes of those he had slain. But this was different. This was not the mechanical, impersonal slaughter of war. This was something far worse. Baba Yaga was studying him. Orris felt his breath hitch, a sickening realization settling in his gut. This man, this thing, was not some frenzied killer mindlessly lashing out in rage. No, every kill had been deliberate, every movement calculated. And now, he was deciding. Orris swallowed hard. His voice trembled when he finally found the courage to speak. Why? The question barely left his lips before he regretted it. Baba Yaga tilted his head slightly, as if considering the weight of the word. A slow exhale left him, and for the first time, he crouched, bringing himself to Orris's level. The captain flinched. "You mock the dead," Baba Yaga said, his voice quiet, almost contemplative. "You laugh at the fallen. You believe yourselves untouchable, simply because time has buried the past." His eyes darkened, and for a brief moment, something flickered beneath the surface, something vast and unfathomable. "Tell me, Captain," he continued, his tone unreadable, "have you ever truly feared for your life?" Oris's throat went dry. "Have you ever felt the cold certainty of death breathing down your neck? Have you ever wondered, not if you would die, but how?" Baba Yaga leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you know what it's like to beg for one more breath?" Oris couldn't speak, couldn't think. His pulse pounded in his ears, his body locked in place. "You don't," Baba Yaga answered for him, "because men like you have only ever known power." The words cut deeper than any blade. Oris clenched his fists, shame and terror warring in his chest. He had laughed. He had mocked. He had thought himself superior, standing above the wounded, believing them weak, believing himself strong. But now, as he stared into the abyss of Baba Yaga's gaze, he understood. He had never been strong. He had simply never been hunted. Tears burned at the edges of his vision. He didn't know if they were from fear or the unbearable weight of realization. Baba Yaga exhaled, standing once more. "The universe is filled with men like you," he murmured. "Men who believe the past can be forgotten, that the dead stay buried." A pause. Then a whisper, so soft that it barely reached Oris's ears. "But the dead remember." The silence stretched, thick with finality. Oris's breath hitched. His mind screamed at him to move, to fight, to do something, but he could only kneel there, helpless beneath the weight of fate. He thought of his squad, their laughter, their arrogance, their corpses. It was so ironic, it was almost poetic. Baba Yaga had been right. Oris had never known fear. Not until now. Not until he realized he was already dead. A blade flashed, and then darkness. Silence had settled over the battlefield like a burial shroud. No cries for mercy, no desperate pleas, no breath left to draw. Only the whisper of the wind moving through the bodies of the fallen, carrying with it the scent of plasma burns, blood, and regret. Baba Yaga stood among the dead, motionless, a lone figure in the wreckage of what had once been a proud Federation unit. A unit that had mocked him, laughed at him, believed themselves untouchable. But they had learned it too late. His blade, darkened with fresh blood, hung loosely from his grip. The weight of the massacre should have felt heavy. Once, long ago, it might have. Now, it was merely a fact, a truth written in the language of war. He exhaled, slow and measured, lifting his gaze toward the horizon. The twin moons of this forsaken world loomed overhead, casting pale silver light upon the carnage. His breath misted in the frigid night air, curling like the ghosts of those he had slain. And in the distance, a sound, the deep, rhythmic thrum of an approaching Federation dropship. Reinforcements. Of course, they would come. The Federation always responded to silence. If a squad failed to report in, it did not take long before they sent others to investigate. The hunt would begin again. A normal man, one with reason, with sense, might have run, might have sought shelter, vanished into the darkness of space before the enemy could descend upon him. But Baba Yaga was not a normal man. He did not run. He did not hide. He simply waited. His fingers tightened around the hilt of his blade, feeling the warmth of fresh blood still clinging to its edge. His heartbeat was steady, his breath measured. He had been through this before. He would go through it again. This was what they had created. This was what they had feared. And now, they would remember why. The Federation's response. Federation Command Center. Secure briefing room. The screen flickered, static crackling before stabilizing. The image was grainy, but clear enough to send eyes through the veins of every officer in the room. A massacre. The bodies of an elite Federation squad, some still in the positions where they had fallen, their expressions frozen in shock, pain, and the sheer horror of what had been done to them. The ground was slick with their blood, their weapons discarded, untouched. Not a single shot had been fired by the enemy. Not a single plasma round had left a Federation rifle. And yet, they were all dead. Commander Verin stood at the head of the room, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, his jaw locked. His silver-threaded uniform sat stiff on his shoulders, a stark contrast to the unease tightening in his chest. He had seen death before. He had seen war. But this This was something else. The officers at the table sat in rigid silence, unwilling to speak first. Varen knew why. They were waiting for him to say it. They wanted him to be the one to acknowledge what this was, who this was. A heavy breath escaped his nose. He turned to his chief intelligence officer, a woman named Severin. Her normally sharp gaze was slightly unfocused, the fingers of her left hand tapping anxiously against the datapad in front of her. Varen didn't blame her. She had studied the legends. She had seen the records. She knew what this meant. Tell me this isn't what I think it is. Varen's voice was low, edged with something dangerously close to hope. Severin swallowed hard. I don't think I can, sir. A heavy silence, the kind that settled in the bones. Varen turned back to the screen, his eyes locked on the carnage, the way the bodies were positioned, the method of the kills, the complete, utter efficiency of it. One man, that was all it had taken. One man against an entire squad of trained Federation killers. And he had wiped them out as if they were nothing. Varen clenched his jaw, his hands curled into fists behind his back, his nails biting into his palms. This isn't possible, one of the officers muttered, breaking the silence at last. He's dead. He's been dead for years. That's what we thought, Severin murmured. That's what we were meant to think, Varen corrected, his voice tight. He had seen this before. Not personally, but in reports, classified files buried so deep that only a handful of high-ranking officers even knew they existed. The methods, the precision, the absolute absence of mercy. A name clawed its way through the layers of time, emerging from the depths of forgotten history. It tasted like rust and smoke, like blood and war, like a ghost that had never truly left. A muscle in Varen's jaw twitched. Baba Yaga. The name dropped like a weight into the room. No one spoke. No one breathed. Then, finally, Severin straightened. Her voice was calm, but her knuckles were white where they gripped the datapad. What are your orders, sir? Varen didn't answer immediately. He turned back to the screen, staring at the still body of Captain Oris, the last to die, the fool who had laughed, who had failed to see the monster standing before him until it was far too late. What could they do? What could anyone do? The Federation had spent years trying to erase this man. They had rewritten history, buried records, hunted every last remnant of the past, desperate to pretend that the unstoppable force they had once created had been destroyed. But the past had a way of rising from its grave. Varen exhaled sharply. We prepare, he said finally. We issue a full alert. Every high-ranking official, every strategic outpost, everyone. No one goes in unprepared. A pause. Then his voice dropped lower. And we send a message. Severin frowned. To who? Varen's gaze did not waver. To him. Another silence, this one heavier than the last. And what do we tell him? Severin asked, her voice barely a whisper. Varen exhaled slowly. He turned from the screen, his expression set, his words final. We tell him the Federation remembers. A beat, and we are afraid.